Welcome to all to the 11th Congress of the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality, ECINEQ. We are delighted that you're joining us today, and I want to start by thanking our hosts, which are in the World Bank, Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, who's the chair of the organizing committee, Hai-Shan Fu, and Nemmers. And I want to also thank GW, in particular the Institute of International Economic Policy. I'm James Foster, and his collaborators for organizing the session of today here. I'm delighted to actually welcome Daron Acemoglu, whom I've known for some time, but have followed for a longer time. And it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Acemoglu, recipient of the 2024 Prize in Economic Sciences, and I quote, for studies of how institutions are formed and affect inequality, unquote. Professor Acemoglu is an institute professor at MIT, a title reserved for the most distinguished members of the faculty. He's also faculty co-director of MIT's Shaping the Future of Work initiative and a research affiliate at MIT, newly established Blueprint Labs. He's an elected fellow of many academies, among them the National Academy of Science, the American Philosophical Society, the British American Academy of Sciences, the Turkish Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, the European Economic Association, and the Society of Labor Economists, as well as a member of the Group of 30. He's also received many accolades, including the inaugural Shultz Prize for the University of Chicago in 2004, the inaugural Sherwin Rosen Award for Outstanding Contribution to Labor Economics in 2004 as well, the Distinguished Science Award from the Turkish Sciences Association in 2006, the John von Neumann Award, Rajk College, Budapest in 2007, the Carnegie Fellowship in 2017, the Jean-Jacques Laffont Prize in 2018, the Global Economy Prize in 2019, and the CME Mathematical and Statistical Research Institute Prize in 2021. And then he also was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal in 2005, the Erwin Plein Nemmers Prize in 2012, and in 2016, the BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award. Of course, Professor Acemoglu received the Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel in 2024 with the Co-Laureates Simon Johnson and James Robinson. As we know, his academic work covers a wide range of areas, including political economy, economic development, economic growth, technological change, inequality, labor economics, and economics of networks. He's the author of numerous articles published in top journals, and also 6 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Why Nations Fail, Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, An Introduction to Modern Economic Growth, The Narrow Corridor, States, Society, and the Fate of Liberty, both with James Robinson, and Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, with Simon Johnson, on which today's lecture will be based. Professor Acemoglu is widely recognized as one of the most influential economists of our time, known for his groundbreaking work on institutions, political economy, technology, and inequality. He has profoundly shaped our understanding of how political and economic institutions affect development and how automation and artificial intelligence are reshaping labor markets and democratic governance. Professor Acemoglu's lecture is entitled, Can Technological Progress Build Shared Prosperity? Lessons from Power and Progress. And let me quote from his prologue on the book on the subject, and I quote now, shared prosperity emerged because, and only when, the direction of technological advances and society's approach to dividing the gains were pushed away from arrangements that primarily served a narrow elite. Most people around the globe today are better off than our ancestors because citizens and workers in early industrial societies organized, challenged elite-dominated choices about technology and work conditions, and force ways of sharing the gains from technical improvements more equitably. Today's progress is again enriching a small group of entrepreneurs and investors, whereas most people are disempowered and benefit little. A new, more inclusive vision of technology can emerge only if the basis of social power changes. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Daron Acemoglu as he delivers his keynote lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you very much, Nora, and it's my pleasure to be here. Inequality, of course, has been a passion for me, and as Nora's quotes have indicated, I think issues of inequality are always intertwined with choices about technology, choices about how we use our collective knowledge, and which directions we try to change the world around us. But part of the reason why Simon Johnson and I wrote the book, Power and Progress, and part of the reason why I have entitled this The Struggle Between Prosperity and Technology, and also asking the question whether technological progress is now still potentially consistent with shared prosperity, is because by many measures, we live in an age of innovation. We are surrounded by new gadgets, new services, new apps every day, and according to most measures of innovation, there has been a marked explosion. So for example, if you look at United States Patent Office patents, they have quadrupled over the last 40 years. And this quadrupling has been led by sectors that most people think are at the center of the entire economy in terms of providing information, providing tools, the information communication technology and electronics and electrical equipment. And that's what this picture is meant to show. And today, this may itself be eclipsed by artificial intelligence, which has become not just the flavor of the month, but the nexus of dreams, investments, and concerns around the world. Increasingly, we understand that AI is going to shape every dimension of our lives, but still, we do not, I believe, sufficiently ask the question of who controls AI, who will benefit from it, and how it can be made consistent with shared prosperity. There are several reasons why I think those questions are shadowed. One is the belief that technology has a predetermined direction, or at least a natural direction in which it's going to progress. And I've already sort of shown my colors by arguing that the direction of technology is an important choice. So the contrast here is between a view in which technology has a natural path, and each technological revolution, as well as perhaps even each technological application, comes with some natural consequences, versus a view that technology as application of our collective knowledge is highly malleable, so we can make different choices with different consequences, both in terms of productivity, and I'll talk about productivity in a second, and also in terms of who wins and who loses. That's number one in the list of things that make us not sufficiently question who wins and who loses and how these decisions are made. The second one is, I think, that's the right one, is what economists have brought to the table, which I think in the grand sweep of history is not a crazy proposition, but I think we need to investigate and explore the limits of this proposition. And this is something that's very second nature to what we learn, what we teach, how we think in economics. In fact, so much so that even though it's very important in shaping economists' view, it doesn't even have a name. So Simon and I gave it the name productivity bandwagon. So the idea, summarized on the left, is that technology improves, so we have better ways of controlling our material, or sometimes even non-material world. Now, we can do many things with that. We could build better bombs, as we have done in the past. But the view in economics is that even if we sort of venture into those areas, one of the main things we're going to do with a better knowledge is to increase productivity. And then once productivity increases, most of the conceptual structures that we use for thinking about the macroeconomy and the labor market imply that this leads to higher wages and workers also benefit. And in fact, that's a very important step for economists, because economists rightly like to point out things that are not obvious to the general public, because that's where the value of economics is most clear. And this link is not so obvious, but it's very strong in many economic models. But actually, the pendulum could swing too much. So the layman intuition may be wrong, but economists can sometimes skip over some assumptions. And in particular, there are actually two assumptions embedded in going from productivity increases to workers always benefiting. The first one, I think, is quite fundamental and often overlooked. When we say productivity increases, what we mean by that is that given the amount of factors of production, labor, material, etc., we produce more. That notion we call average productivity. But of course, economics very clearly indicates that average productivity and marginal productivity are not the same. But the argument often equates, or at least implicitly assumes, that average and marginal productivity are related, so that when productivity increases, workers become more valuable to firms. And the channel from the green bubble to the red bubble is that as productivity increases, firms want to hire more workers. And second, that desire somehow translates into higher wages. If it does that, then because there is an increase in wages and most people in the economy are wage earners, there is a direct channel from productivity improvements to shared prosperity. However, both of these suppositions are sometimes right, sometimes wrong. They are actually institutional, and they are about the direction of technology. Let me start with the latter, which is that actually an increase in productivity, which then brings, say, an increase in marginal productivity, will, through market dynamics, lead to an increase in wages. Well, I have two examples here of perhaps things that today we wouldn't think of as transformative as AI, but for their time they were entirely revolutionary. On the left are the windmills, which completely revolutionized the medieval economy. And on the right, it's Eli Whitney's cotton gin. He may or may not have been the first one, but the cotton gin undoubtedly completely transformed both the economy of the US South and the world economy. The US South was a complete backwater before the introduction of the cotton gin. And once the cotton gin enabled the cleaning of the type of cotton variety that could be grown in the US South, it became the largest producer, the largest exporter of cotton to the world, and the engine of the British Industrial Revolution in the textile phase. I put those two because however revolutionary they were, they did not actually lead to improvements in the living conditions of the workers. On the left, the windmills revolutionized the medieval economy, but peasant wages, living standards did not improve. On the right, the conditions of the actual workers who did the cotton production, thanks to the cotton gin, may actually have gone worse because those were the enslaved black Americans who were shifted into the deep South, into large cotton plantations, and they had to work longer hours for no better pay. And in both cases, of course, the culprit for why the standard economic intuition that the productivity bandwagon will work doesn't actually apply is quite clear. These were not conditions under which there were competitive markets. the peasants in the medieval economy were locked into a variety of semi-coercive relationships, and the cotton workers, being slaves, were of course even under worse conditions. So when their owners wanted to move them to the U.S. South, to the deeper South, to the cotton plantations, they didn't have to pay higher wages. They just had to use coercion. So labor market institutions are important. And I think that's probably no news to many people here who have thought about institutions more generally. But the first element of the argument is perhaps a little bit more subtle, so it needs to be explored a little bit. What is the relationship between technology increasing average productivity and marginal productivity? And I think this is important for the Industrial Revolution, but much more broadly. And perhaps the best way that I find of explaining this is actually referring to a modern a story or an oft-mentioned quote about modern factory, which has many claimants, so I'm not even going to say who said that first. Where the idea that, or the story is, the modern factory will have two employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure that the man doesn't touch the equipment. So the story is, some people's utopia, some people's dystopia, but what it emphasizes is that many of the modern technologies are not labor intensive. They are focused on automating or replacing tasks previously were performed by workers using machinery or today algorithms. And many improvements will not necessarily require essential services from labor. If that's the case, average productivity can go up. We can improve those equipments in the modern factory, but that better equipment is not going to make the factory owners want to hire more laborers or more dogs. In that case, in fact, and that's the humorous part of the story, that the modern factory is working fine, thank you, and you don't need the human. The human is just there to feed the dog, quite dispensable. So the marginal productivity is going towards zero. So there could be a big wedge between marginal productivity and average productivity when automation is in action. The Industrial Revolution illustrates both of these channels quite powerfully. First of all, during the Industrial Revolution, many workers were in a weak position relative to employers. Trade unions were completely banned. Workers often were forced to work under very disciplinarian conditions. But also, a lot of the early phase of the British Industrial Revolution was about what was called then textile mechanization, or what I would call now automation, substitution of new machinery for the labor of workers. It was this process that led, for example, to the mechanization of weaving, which used to be one of the most lucrative occupations. The labor aristocracy of Britain were the weavers. And after the mechanization of weavers, wages fell about 2/3, as previously skilled weavers were now working with power looms for much lower wages. This is important because sometimes we are told worries about AI or other technologies that could be revolutionary becoming, engines of inequality are overblown because the Industrial Revolution shows that, at the end everybody benefits. Well, at the end, what's often glossed over in those accounts is that it took about 100 years, more than 3 generations. So if you date the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to 1750, wages fell or remained constant for the period up to 1840s and only started increasing after the 1850s. So all of this may be economic history or deep history that you may not care about because modern times may be different. Modern times, we are dealing with very different technologies, and we supposedly have more enlightened elites than the slave owner of the US South or the monks and noble people of the medieval era. Well, there is a sense in which modern times are different, and there is a sense in which modern times are actually showing strange parallels. First of all, modern times are indeed different, because if you look at the data, and I'm only showing part of that data because you need to splice in other sources, and I'm not doing that here. But if you look at the data in the US, and the story is very similar in many other industrialized countries, from the end of World War II, you see a period of very rapid growth of productivity, going hand in hand with very rapid wage growth. In fact, wages grew a little bit faster than productivity. But even more remarkably, all demographic groups more or less benefited. So if you look at wages, for example, by education or gender, women's wages were increasing a little bit faster, and low education workers' wages were increasing a little faster in the 1940s, a lot faster in the 1950s, a lot faster in the 1940s, and more or less at the same speed in the 1960s. So this is what I mean by shared prosperity, economic growth from which all demographic groups are benefiting. But the figures also show a sea change from around 1980 when you see these curves opening up. So the top curve, which is for postgraduates shown in dark blue, continues to increase. College graduates, men are not doing so good for some periods they're growing, women are doing a little bit better. But most jarringly, workers who are high school graduates or less than high school are seeing their real wages decline for a period of about 30 years, which is, really unparalleled when you think about it. So in some sense, modern times are different because we've had this experience of shared prosperity with rapid technological progress, but they're also repeating some of the patterns that we saw during the Industrial Revolution. So we want to understand, I think, if we want to answer the question of when and how technology can be consistent with shared prosperity, we want to understand how it was that that period of shared prosperity was built, what were the institutional and technological preconditions to it, and why it came apart. Right off the bat, I showed you the US data, so you might think there was a necessity that, for example, digital technologies necessarily meant that only the skilled would benefit. Well, the story is a little bit more complicated. It is true that all industrialized countries have been affected by more or less the same phenomena. And there are many commonalities. So if you look at what technologies are doing, for instance, replacing blue-collar workers or office workers, there are a lot of parallels between what goes on in the Netherlands, what goes on in France, Germany, the Scandinavia. But there are also differences. So on the left, for example, I'm showing what's going on with inequality in Sweden. And what's very interesting is that overall inequality increases in Sweden, so especially capital income is becoming very important, but wage inequality is not increasing. So different institutions, even with technological changes that are somewhat similar, are leading to different outcomes, which emphasizes again that there is an important element of choice, both in institutions, but I would argue even more importantly about how you use technology and how you develop technology. So with that background, let's ask the question, when does technological progress really deliver shared prosperity? And my discussion of the productivity bandwagon hopefully already gave you the clues. So when I explained that, I said there are two preconditions for the productivity bandwagon. One is that average and marginal productivity go hand in hand. So when productivity increases because of application of new technologies, new machinery, new algorithms, that also increases the marginal productivity of labor so that actually workers are contributing more meaningfully to jobs. And second, the institutional environment is such that worker voice or other preconditions are there for some of that improvement to be shared with the workers. For example, competitive labor markets, or if there are negotiations, workers having the ability to be organized themselves as well. Now, the first one is a little complicated because in most of our models, we think of just capital accumulation. Well, if all that's going on is capital accumulation, perhaps it's natural that marginal productivity and average productivity would go hand in hand. But actually, when you look at data, the last 250 years have been periods of uneven but constant automation. So automation is not something that just happened during the Industrial Revolution. It's not just something that AI is bringing. Automation is a constant process as more and more advanced machinery is capable of taking over some of the tasks. And hallelujah for that, because some of the tasks that machinery has taken over, some of the hardest tasks, digging ditches, lifting very heavy equipment, very heavy objects, or carrying big boxes. Those are things that were backbreaking, dangerous, and so on and so forth. So automation has benefits and positives as well as costs. But the problem is that if automation is ongoing, and what I said so far applies, you would expect a constantly expanding wedge between average and marginal product. And that's going to really throw a spanner into the wheels of shared prosperity. But fortunately, automation is not the only thing that technological change does. technological change can also create new tasks for workers. In fact, if you think about what people around you are doing today as their occupations, most of the things that people around you are doing didn't exist 60 years ago. And even in occupations like dentists, journalists, academics, many of the tasks that we are performing didn't exist then because they were enabled by technologies, new ways of organizing things, and so on. You see an emblematic application of this in the top picture, which is one of the factories, early factories that Henry Ford built for producing cars, a first step towards mass production. And Henry Ford and his factories and his engineers were masters at introducing new equipment, decentralized electricity, sources together with new equipment that could organize production very differently and perform some of the tasks. But at the same time, this also necessitated a whole range of new activities from workers. So you see there a lot of workers who are working with the machinery, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, because in the back office, there are many people working on maintenance, back office tasks, clerical tasks, and so on and so forth. So the engineering miracle of mass production was as much about creating new tasks, and so was the 3 decades that I mentioned. And at the bottom, you see something else that was very important in the history of the auto industry and then later, which is union organization. Unions were very strong in the auto industry, and that was a very important part of why, as employment grew, as mass production came into existence, there were also higher wages. So these are the 2 pillars. And unsurprisingly, given that I am constructing the narrative this way, these were the 2 pillars that became undone when the digital age accelerated, starting around the late 1970s, early 1980s. Here is what an auto factory now looks like. You see more fancy, more beautiful robots, but what you don't see are the workers that were doing things together with the machines in the Ford factory. There's just one chap there, but he's just watching, and he's probably a university graduate who has programmed these machines rather than a manual worker. So as robots were introduced, manual workers were laid off, and that is a very important part of the inequality changes in the United States. In fact, this is one thing I want to spend one more slide on, because it's not the standard story that sometimes people hear, but my own work emphasizes that automation has not been just a very important driver of the wedge between capital share and labor share, but also has been the most important driver of between-group inequalities. Why some groups, like the ones that I showed with the postgraduates, have done quite well, while others have been lagging behind, or in fact falling behind. So to do that, I'm showing you one more graph. This is from work I've done with Pasquale Restrepo, which now looks at more disaggregated demographic groups, not just by gender and education, as I've shown you in the previous chart, but by gender, education, ethnicity, and age. And also focuses not on the time series evolution, but the critical period where inequality increases between 1980 and 2015. So each one of these dots signifies one of these demographic groups. And on the vertical axis, you see the change of that demographic group's real hourly wage between 1980 and 2015. The horizontal line, which is a little bit faint, but hopefully you can see it, is at 0. So you can see that about half of the dots are below the 0. So those are the half of the groups that are not really benefiting from economic growth during this 35-year period. But more importantly is the horizontal axis, which is our measure of automation. Roughly speaking, is the fraction of tasks that a demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated. And you see a very strong relationship that accounts for something like 65% of the overall change in between-group inequality. So if you want to understand inequality in the United States, it's all about automation, but it's not just about automation. And moreover, automation itself is not a force of nature. It's an endogenous choice that companies make, and that's why I'm going to build it to AI. But if you want to understand the second leg of both why productivity growth did not translate into wage growth, and also why there was an environment in which technological change could freely go in an automation direction, I think you have to understand the institutional context. And the institutional context has many layers. I won't mention all of them, but two are particularly important. One is that there was a shift in the priorities of management. I don't think you can blame it on Milton Friedman, but I think he was a good emissary of it. His most famous work is something he wrote in the New York Times Magazine, where he argued the only social responsibility of business is to increase profits. And that was sort of crystallizing things that were already up in the air, which is that managers shouldn't have loyalty to their workers and should engage in extensive cost cutting, be it with automation, be it with harder bargains. And that's exactly what we see, and Milton Friedman's and some other thinkers' ideas about re-engineering the corporation started being propagated by business schools and became even more influential in the United States and then later in Europe. I think that's one very important part. And it was a big complement to automation. And also the union movement, which in the past was one of the, in an incompetent way sometimes, but was one of the barriers into very rapid automation, also became decimated, both because of deindustrialization that had been going on for a while, but also because of Reagan, for example, took a very strong anti-union attitude, for example, with the firing of the Petco strikers. But all of this doesn't still get to the most important aspect of the choice element, and that is about the direction of technology. Why is it that digital technologies were used so much for automation? And I think that is a choice of managers. That's where the Friedman ideas matter. But it's also, you've got to fight the war with the troops that you have, and the troops that you have as a manager are the technologies that you can buy, you can implement, and those came from the tech sector. And there, the tech sector's decisions become very important. These had economic elements, what the tech companies, especially growing concentration, implied for the direction of technological change, but also it had an ideological direction. And the ideological direction, especially important now for AI, goes back to that brilliant gentleman, Alan Turing, who you know from your either math readings or from your Hollywood movie watching, was a genius in many respects, but he also had a very specific vision of what digital tools were about. And not the only vision, as I'm going to explain in a second. His vision was that digital tools should be thought as semi-autonomous, high-level capabilities, and ultimately they're going to become like humans. And in that process, it's only natural that they should take over more and more tasks, an idea that became more crystallized in the AI field, for example, with the founding conference in Dartmouth in 1956, etc. So this vision, which came both from philosophical ideas and science fiction, became a dominant thing that the most natural way of developing digital technologies is to mimic human capabilities and ultimately take over human tasks. So a very strong drive towards automation. Now, even if that's the vision, even if it becomes a reality, it could still be consistent with some weak form of shared prosperity because it increases productivity very much. And after all, the age of innovation that I mentioned was meant to be this productivity driver. But that's the problem that we are seeing, which is a puzzling aspect. The digital age, just like Bob Solow noted in 1987, still doesn't seem to have translated into productivity improvement. So if you look at economists' favorite measure of total factor productivity, the decades of 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s were on the whole, despite frequent recessions and so on, very rapid TFP changes, sometimes over 2%, sometimes over 3%. The digital age I'm showing in orange, you hardly ever make it past 1%. So in some sense, we are not getting the promised productivity improvements, and nobody knows why. It could be mismeasurement, well, it doesn't suggest that. It could be organizational adjustments, variety of things. But I think part of it is that we're not really realizing the promise of digital technologies. And we're not realizing it because digital technologies are not really necessarily things that could only be used or mainly be used for automation. Especially if you go too much into automation, you are automating tasks that can be performed or sometimes are quite well performed by humans. In the service industry and sometimes in the manufacturing industry, examples abound where you automate tasks and you then realize that machines are not yet ready and productivity, service quality, and other things actually suffer. And we are also using these technologies more and more for information collection. Information collection may be quite attractive for thinking about what we could learn about people, sometimes controlling people, but it doesn't necessarily translate into productivity improvements. Surveillance has other implications, not so good for democracy, not so good for decentralization, not so good for freedoms, but it's not a natural handmaiden of productivity improvements. So I think if we want to, I'm going out of order because given time is short, I want to get to this slide. I think what I want to sort of tie this to is the direction of technology, and especially the direction of AI. And I think if we want to do that, we have to think about the engineering aspect, we have to talk about the economic aspect, and we have to talk about the ideology or vision aspect. By the economic engineering aspect, I mean what kind of technologies. By the economic aspect, what would take for different types of technologies to be developed and to be marketed. And the ideological aspect about what the priorities of the tech industry are going to be. And this is where recognizing that the Turing human-like AI or AGI vision wasn't the only one. In fact, at the same time as Alan Turing was writing about the imitation game, another giant in the field, MIT's Norbert Wiener, was writing about robots in 1949. And his concern was that robots were neither the best use of using digital technologies and would be incompatible with wage growth. Instead, he proposed the idea that we should think of machines, especially digital technologies, as a complement to humans. This is what Simon and I call machine usefulness, or machine usefulness to human, rather than machine intelligence. Norbert Wiener himself was more interested in the mathematics and the high-level philosophical ideas, but several other engineers and computer scientists built on those ideas. One was Douglas Engelbart, who you may not know about, but you should. He is responsible for more technologies that you completely depend on than I think pretty much anybody else. So the computer mouse was his invention. Hyperlinks, hypertext, and menu-driven computers all came out of Douglas Engelbart's work. Many of them were revealed, were presented to the public in an event which he called the Mother of All Demos in 1968, and that's the first mouse. And Douglas Engelbart's philosophy was that machines should be complementary to humans, should enable humans to perform more tasks, and that's exactly what the computer mouse, hyperlink, hypertext, etc. were about. J.C.R. Licklider, who I think deserves the title of grandfather of the internet, was very much in the same mode as well. He argued in 1960 that the best use that information technology could be is by providing information so that humans can expand what they can do, and he also applied many of these ideas in other contexts as well. And I think AI is a game changer, because when J.C.R. Licklider wrote about it in 1960, he said, in the next few years, human minds and computers are going to be coupled like nobody can imagine. Well, he was expressing an aspirations, not a reality, because the technologies of the time and of the 1970s, of the 1980s, 90s, 2000s were not up to the task. Information is abundant today, but useful information is scarce. Everything you want and a lot of things you don't want are on the internet, but when you need something to perform a specific task, you cannot find it. For example, if you're an electrician, you often have to deal with problems you haven't met, and that's going to become more and more real because there are more sophisticated equipment, there are new data centers, new electricity grids, etc., etc. Well, that requires much higher level of sophisticated understanding. You need specific knowledge, useful knowledge to deal with these things. And how are you going to get that? Well, training and becoming one of the best electricians in the world would help, but only a few of the people can become one of the best electricians in the world. AI can provide real-time information for people to perform more expertise needing, more sophisticated new tasks. And again, we're back to new tasks. So that's the better AI direction. Better AI is critical, not just because I think it is the way to build shared prosperity is actually, I think, going to be much more revolutionary in terms of productivity gains. If you think about, what are the companies that have changed the world? Few people would think of, oh, that company, they cut labor costs by 15% and completely revolutionized everything. The companies that you think are revolutionary are companies like Ford or General Motors or General Electric that introduce new goods, services, and new ways of organizing things. There, nothing like that existed. Those are companies that create new tasks as well. So if you can leverage AI to be complementary to workers, to be pro-worker, I think it expands greatly the capabilities to do that. In particular, in places that are so important for the economy and our bottlenecks, education, healthcare, other services, we sorely need productivity growth, and that's about new services, new organizations, and I think that's where AI can help, but only if it just gets out of that automation emphasis. Now, why are we not going there? Well, I've pointed out we haven't recognized enough the need to do that. The economic models where large companies make money isn't based on the basis of this sort of pro-worker AI. And the ideological straitjacket that AGI obsession puts on us doesn't push us there. This is true for the US. It's also true for the developing world, because whatever is good for US workers are likely to be good for the developing world as well. How are we going to get there? Well, I think just leaving all the decisions to Silicon Valley elites is not going to be enough. Of course, companies should be run by their founders, and those should have a say. But when you have transformative enough technologies that are going to affect every aspect of the future, leaving those decisions just in the hands of Sam Altman and Elon Musk is not going to be enough. So you need democratic oversight in the direction of technology as well, which is actually, when you look at the past, were quite important. People are rightly skeptical that the government can have much leadership role in technology. I certainly don't believe that the government is well equipped to be the entrepreneur and choose what technologies to implement and what not. But government oversight and steering in the more socially beneficial directions, which in this case is more pro-worker AI, more decentralized AI, and I would say also communication technologies that are more pro-democratic, is important. And there are examples that show how that can be done. And here is one. If you look at the situation with the energy sector, it's nowhere as you would have hoped, but it's completely different than it was in the 1990s or 2000s, when we all knew the climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, but there was no alternative to fossil fuels. Today, renewable energy is actually cost competitive with fossil fuels. How did that happen? It happened because there was a tremendous amount of innovation and learning by doing in renewable technologies, and that was thanks to a few regulations, a little bit of carbon tax in a few countries, and quite a bit of subsidies. So even that modicum of steering has had transformative effects in the energy sector, and I think when it comes to the future of AI, those are even more necessary. Thank you very much. It's been great, and now I look forward to the Q&A with Nora. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much, Daron, for this talk. I am glad that I read your book before, even before we invited you, actually. And I think that now what we're going to do is open to questions. Don't know if anybody in the public wants to start. I can't see. I mean, those that have white shirts, I see them. So if you could please bring the microphone. If you can identify yourself.
I'm Garance Nico, and I'm curious about the power aspect and what are going to, you had a few slides or image on the workers and unions, and it's really not obvious how and why it would happen. When you look at the first half of the 20th century, there was a moment where union membership in the US was only 10%, and then it's FDI, if I'm not mistaken, that actually put in some regulation that helped union to get formed, and then they got to 30%. But at this day and age where it's not even by industry that workers could be organized, that tasks are more replaceable, it's just very hard to see how to get a really organized worker movement in order for some of those, goodwill or beneficial change to come to place.
I agree, it's even worse than that because the standard union approach wouldn't work. The way that unions, especially in the US, after the Taft-Hartley Act, bargain is they bargain on plant level or business unit level wages and business conditions. That won't work because if what you do is you ask for higher wages, you increase incentives for automation. So what you need is, first of all, a broader labor movement focus that's much more on technology choice. And the reason why I think it's not completely impossible is actually one way in which AI technologies fail is that they don't understand the sectors that they are trying to transform. And the main thing they don't understand is tacit knowledge. And who has that tacit knowledge? It's the workers. So if there is the right kind of worker movement, it wouldn't be conflictual so much as actually helpful for businesses, because it can help businesses find the right type of technological solutions that leverage tacit knowledge, and that's all about making workers more productive. Not every business would do that, but if some businesses did that, and at least some businesses have paid lip service to it, but you need a bigger transformation, and possibly the Taft-Hartley Act is a big barrier to it. But I think we do need some sort of labor voice, and we do need some sort of democratic oversight. None of it is very straightforward right now, but it's the only path.
So, right here, Andreas? Yes, please.
Thanks. Yeah, Andreas Peichel from the University of Munich. Very interesting talk. Thanks a lot. I was wondering, when thinking about the situation in European countries, in Germany, for example, the workforce is going to shrink in the next 10, 15 years. So we will lose roughly 400,000 workers per year because of demographic change. And so how relevant is this? Or a lot of people are arguing, okay, it's actually good that AI is going to replace humans in this setting. And so we shouldn't be too much worried about it because we need more workers anyway. We don't get them. Immigration is a hot issue. And so isn't it a good thing that AI is replacing workers in such countries?
Well, I think you could look at it as glass half full, half empty. So before AI, if you look at industrial automation, labor shortage, in particular demographic change-induced labor shortage, was a major driver. And in fact, demographic change of the sort that you're describing is helpful because it pushes up wages and it creates both a more natural way in which to use automation technology and also a desire on the part of workers to use the labor that they have in a more productive way. So some of the examples of how companies have used labor more productively with new, sometimes digital technologies actually come from Germany, Japan, and South Korea, 3 countries that went through very rapid demographic change already. But there's no guarantee that demographic change will be used as an opportunity rather than squandered. If we get, again, too focused on automation, I think it will backfire. Japanese companies, for example, first tried that, and they tried to deal with the severe demographic change and population decline in Japan by over-automating, and it didn't work. It was only a process of trial and error that got them there. German companies where I think we're luckier because of the work councils, workers on the board, and the apprenticeship system. So they understood from early on that they wanted to keep the labor. So they, for example, when they introduced robots, they retrained blue-collar workers in a way that you'd never see that in the United States. But Germany is having now other problems, so it's not clear how all of that is going to be played out. But I think demographic change is actually an opportunity in this context.
Over there, please, and I'm going to switch to here. If you can say your name first, it'd be nice.
Thank you very much for your lecture, Felipe Valencia Caicedo, Brown University. I was wondering if you could expand on international inequality. I mean, you talked quite a bit about the US, but I'm wondering, I mean, are developing countries going to be leaders or followers? I mean, you talked quite a bit about patents, and there's also international implications on that. So if you could just expand on international inequality. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. I think most likely developing countries will be left behind, would be my concern. So I worry that AI could be the mother of all inappropriate technologies. So the concept of inappropriate technology was coined to describe technologies that are developed in the North, but are not a good fit for the needs, competencies, and factor endowments of the South. I think if you look at rapid economic growth throughout the developing world, it has always leveraged labor. So if AI goes in the automation direction, it will take away this ladder for many developing countries, and it might actually reverse, for example, advances that were made in many countries because of offshoring, outsourcing, or other parts manufacturing, or supply services, and so on and so forth. So in some sense, I view a direction that's more pro-worker in the United States or in the OECD as complementary to the needs of the developing nations as well. But there, the problem is even worse because, we can be pessimistic, but at least there is a labor movement, there's a democratic process. Right now, there are about 6 billion people who absolutely have no voice in the future of AI, unless you live in the United States or Europe, perhaps in the elite in China. Your views don't have a mechanism of influencing the direction of AI. So I think that's another question that we have to worry about from an institutional perspective.
Over here.
Hi, Freddie Papazian at Texas Tech. Great talk as always, Daron. My question, I've been curious throughout the whole talk. So the story in Power and Progress, I'm wondering how it interacts with the story in Narrow Corridor, right? Because, Power and Progress is looking at this productive form of capital, right? Whereas in Narrow Corridor, you're looking at this unproductive rent-seeking form of capital, right? Power. So I'm curious, how does it interact? So specifically the shrinking of the Narrow Corridor or not? Is it as simple as whether or not AI is going to go towards automation versus more complementary route, or what?
So thank you, Freddie. That's a great question. I think there are several interactions, and there are probably more that need to be developed. The first one is indeed, if AI goes more and more towards automation, it will narrow the corridor, meaning that it's going to make it harder to strike the right balance between bottom-up participation and top-down control. But I think if the comments that I was trying to make at the end about how to steer technology are also very much inspired by the narrow corridor ideas, in the following sense that I'm not a believer that you can social engineer change top-down. You can have some influence top-down, but it needs to be a bottom-up process. Innovation is a very bottom-up process, so you have to recognize that, you have to enable that, but then some of the parameters can be influenced by the right sort of regulatory action. So in some sense, that is another question of balance between state and society.
Over there was someone. Sorry, you have to go all the way up now. Good exercise. It's over there. Oh, she's pointing at someone. Yeah, I don't see people in the back, so I apologize.
Vincenzo Galasso, Bocconi University. Daron, I have more of a political economy question that relates to one of the talks that you gave in Bocconi recently. So sort of like your better AI, I was wondering, how do you see that coming up? Like, it sounds like a great manifesto for lots of traditional parties that have failed in the past, and they could actually see, that's the way to go forward. But at the same time, it doesn't look like something that can be done at the national level. I mean, what you're talking about seems like something that needs to be done at a much higher level, and so it requires lots of coordination. So how do you see that potentially coming up?
It's a great question, and I don't have an answer. But when I was asked that question by a president, I won't name them, but I gave the following answer, which is, I think the problem will be solved if tomorrow we woke up and 60% of researchers in Silicon Valley decided that they wanted to work on pro-worker AI. I think it's that simple. Now, the hard part is, of course, how are you going to get there? I don't think there's an easy way of getting to the research direction in the research hub of the world when it comes to AI and digital technologies to change. But shifting the narrative, having these conversations, and also some sort of democratic and labor movement pressure whenever it's possible can get you there. So it was, I don't know whether this was lip service, democratic sort of showmanship, or whatever, but it was all open to the public, so I'm not divulging any information. There was a very public and potentially important set of Senate hearings on AI. The first one invited just the tech firms, but then the third one, where I was part of, had a lot of diverse voices, and in fact, half of the participants were from the labor movement. Of course, then Trump got elected, but that could have been just window dressing, but at least was a very different conversation in that hearing than what you had in the first one where it was just a tech company. So it's a gradual change, but I don't think it's completely impossible.
There was someone here. There's someone here on this extreme right, sorry, my extreme right. Your extreme left. Then I come to this side. Here, there's someone over there. It's a challenge. But let me give it. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, there. Hi, my name is Veronica Hion. Thank you for your insights. I'm a recent GW graduate in economics. And from what I've read of your work, I've seen that your productivity gains forecasts are a lot smaller than other larger firms that predict between 8 and 14% productivity gains in the next decade. So my first question is towards that. What do you see as the big assumptions and the difference in how you constructed those forecasts? And then the second one is a little more related to workforce. And recently, Anthropic CEO Daron Acemoglu claimed that he believed his AI models would wipe out around 50% of entry white-level colored jobs in the next 5 years, and that it would generate unemployment levels in the 10s and the 20%, which is also a very bold claim. So I'm curious to see how you
thank you for that question. In fact, I think the answer to both of them are the same. I think some of the people in the industry and some of the economists, in my opinion, are a little bit too bullish in how quickly these technologies can spread. When you look at AI, really serious applications of AI require organizational change, a whole lot of complementary skills, and our experience from other technologies, and of course AI could be different, is that they do spread more slowly. So my guess is that in 5 years' time, no occupation will have been eliminated. it will, AI will have impacted several dimensions of our lives, but not, completely changed our lives. So I think it's going to be a gradual process, and I think the productivity gains from specific tasks is also going to be somewhat smaller because it's going to take a while. But ultimately, it's going to be a big deal. I don't doubt that, but it's just slower. But that's also good because it gives us more time to adapt. So it's not a bad thing. I don't see that as I see that as AI realism, not AI pessimism.
Okay. Cecilia?
Yes. Cecilia García Peñalosa from Aix-Marseille University. Let me bring the debate back to inequality. You're telling us that to solve inequality tomorrow, we need more innovators that think about pro-worker innovations. And maybe the way to deal with that is to have more equality today. Some recent work shows that the direction of technologies that innovators developed are very much influenced by their gender, ethnic, and socioeconomic background. So is your 60% of innovators thinking about pro-workers innovation the result of policies that allow more people today to become innovators?
Absolutely. I think more competition of every dimension and more diversity would not be a bad thing at all.
Anybody on this side, over there?
I think there's a gentleman there.
There was one there and one. There was someone there, and then we come to you. Is okay? But stay with them. Again, I can't see very well.
So this is the sixth industrial revolution. You said that many developing countries isn't catching up. Then also this kind of AI and this kind of AI and the mass into production and services is gonna require a lot of strong infrastructures and mass infrastructures. That means most of these underdeveloped countries and developing countries aren't catching up. And yeah, and like you said, many of these people don't even have the idea of it and cannot even evolve into this. Then we said many we already said the questions here, but how do you have any ideas or any of the solution of this? Because it's clearly I can see it happening in the next 50 years. Do you have any idea of the solution of this?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. There are many countries in the developing world that don't have the infrastructure and are not investing. Some countries are investing, but the costs and some of the benefits could be realized even without that because the international division of labor changes. So in particular, some of the costs in terms of job losses could be just because of the changes in the international division. But absolutely, the public infrastructure and focus on AI in the developing world are very important priorities also.
Here, the last question then.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm Joseph Gasworth from George Washington. And to implement your idea, which is very good, I call it the MIT idea because it came from Norbert Wiener, you need to have an educated workforce. Now, how would you recommend improving the level of education, especially in the US where you have 50 different states?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. So it's a two-way street. But what we need more education isn't just like college education. I think with the right kind of AI, you also need investments in specific skills. So community colleges play that role. They don't anymore. They're not up to the task. So a revamping of community colleges or other vocational courses, other ways of organizing colleges, more sort of business college partnerships. Those are experiments that we, I think, have to think through. Thank you.
All right, so let's give a big round of applause to our speaker. Thanks again, Daron, for joining us. His schedule became incredibly busy, as you can imagine, so we were very fortunate that we were there even before he won the prize. So thank you. We really appreciate that you joined us. By the way, I want to make an announcement. I'm Nora Lustig, the president of ECINEQ, the outgoing president. The new one will be Cecilia García Peñalosa right here. I want to invite everybody that's registered in ECINEQ tomorrow to the General Assembly. We will announce the Atkinson Prize, who won the elections for the executive the council of ECINEQ, and other good news that I want to share with everybody. So please remember to join us at 5:30. That will be followed by the social dinner, as they call it, which I don't remember where it is, but I'm sure it's on the program. Thank you very much again for joining us.